Managing across a fully remote global team requires a complete rewiring of how you think about leadership. You have to get out of the driver's seat and instead focus on creating an environment where the team drives itself. And when the team is responsible for collaborative innovation, the stakes get higher. From planning how teams communicate with one another, developing an operating rhythm that creates unity across geographies, and figuring out how to get everyone moving in the same direction. There is one core principle that will make you successful. It's the principle of hard now, easy later. Just like finding your next great hire, the more time that you spend up front, clarifying goals, aligning expectations, and designing how work and communication happen, especially in a global environment, the easier execution becomes. Skip that, and things feel easy today, but quickly become chaotic tomorrow. Over time, that cost shows up as misalignment, burnout, and unmanageable workload. Whether you're hiring, building a global team, or scaling complex work, intentional planning up front is what reduces friction and stress over the long term. Today's guest is Ralf Gommers, CEO of Quansight. Ralf is one of the most respected leaders in the scientific Python community, with major roles across NumPy, SciPy, and the Python Array API standard. Today, he manages a community-driven global organization that innovates across more than 15 countries. In this conversation, we're going to unpack these 3 key takeaways. Number 1, the recipe for successfully leading innovative global teams comes down to prioritizing process clarity, trust, and systems over proximity and control. Number 2, building fairness into global compensation comes down to more than just a one-size-fits-all. Taking a tailored approach to regional employee compensation helps ensure that team members feel cared for. And number 3, micromanagement does not work with top developers. They need leaders who set clear expectations, verify outcomes, and protect the environment that allows great work to happen. If you're leading technical talent or preparing to scale a team globally, this episode offers a grounded, experience-tested outlook on what actually works. Today, as the CEO of Quansight, he's doing some different things, and I'm excited to dig in and learn a little bit more about you, Ralf. So Ralf, thank you for joining the show.
Thanks for having me, Greg.
All right. Well, hey, let's start kind of where we are today, right? You're the CEO of Quansight. I know for a little while you were their director of, it was like their innovation labs. And so can you tell me a little bit about that evolution and what you're doing today as the CEO of Quansight?
All right. Yeah, I joined Quansight like right at the beginning of the company. And Travis, who was the CEO back then, like I had a relationship through open source with him for like a decade already. And, he wanted like a community focused part of the company. So we make our money by doing consulting around open source, primarily like, scientific computing, machine learning, AI, data science. But that's all built on like a number of key open source projects. So the core of our company is we employ a lot of the people that are like, senior maintainers or creators of these libraries. And that has 2 purposes. On the one hand, it's a great pitch to clients, right? It's like, there's like 1 million people who use this stuff, or maybe 20 million, right? Depending on the library. But there's only a few people who created that. So they can tell you exactly like, what the strong and weak parts are, what to avoid, what to build on. So that makes for an easy pitch when you say like, we're doing high-end consulting. But on the other hand, it's good for the maintainers to get paid working with things that they build. They get feedback from the real world, but then we can also fund them to spend part of their time like improving the open source projects and the communities around them. So that was the pitch from the beginning. So Travis was focused on like business development and consulting. So he's like, okay, why don't you come build this new Quansight Labs, which was the community focused division. And so we ran that as a, let's say, public benefit part of the company from the start. So it had to just break even. I grew that from 1 or 2 people to, where it ended up with like 30 and a revenue of the order of 4 million a year. So in big business context, 4 million a year is not small. In an open source context, like that's fairly significant.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's pretty cool. And so community-based has really been the focus, it sounds like, of Quansight from the start, in the beginning. So I'm curious, as you continue to grow, do you, and maybe you're bringing on financing or not. I know we talked a little bit about the perils and the pros and the cons of doing that. How do you keep your company, as a CEO now, this is your job, right? It's like, how do you keep your company focused on being community-based when you have these external pressures to continue generating revenue?
Oh, that's a great question. So one, I think I understand very well how to keep things community-based because I did this as a volunteer on like Friday nights and weekends for a decade, right? And I decided, I'm an experimental physicist by training. I'm not a software engineer, right? So I taught myself software engineering while, doing applied physics. And then I worked in industry for a while, and like that just got harder and harder. And that's why I joined this company. So I know what the pain points and the struggles are. And I know like if I was still doing this on my Friday night, what I do want to see and what I don't want to see. Right.
So you're basically following the trail of what's fun for you, right? Like what's keeping you engaged, what you would like to have, like if you were a user of your product, where you would receive the benefit.
Exactly. And yeah, so I've done both, right? Often in my day job, I was using these tools and, in the evening I would like develop them. But I would also, I know when somebody else contributes to it, I know what makes, what I'd like to see. Any contribution that fixes a bug or like makes it easier for others to work on the library or just increases performance, that's an easy one, right? But there are also these contributions that are like just create extra work for other people while it only solves like, the submitter's personal problem, but it really doesn't help anyone else, right? That's exactly the thing you don't want to see. So now with my CEO hat on, like that is primary, right? Like we don't want to do things that make the community's life or individual maintainers' lives harder, right? They got to see the win. Otherwise, like, what are we doing?
I love that. And so that obviously came from your own vested interests, right? You're trying to develop things that are going to make your own life easier. And you're putting your, developer hat on and thinking, hey, for this community of developers, everything that we do needs to solve multiple problems and make everyone's life easier. Maybe where they can get from A to Z a lot quicker. Now, I'm curious because you mentioned, and I was looking at your education ahead of time, right? You have a PhD in physics, and you're practicing experimental physics. And so I can't connect the dots. Can you connect the dots for me on how being a physicist, in turn has made you a very good data scientist, and maybe some of the lessons you learned from that?
Actually, a lot of people that we employ, but in the community in general, are coming from a physics or, math or biology background. And actually a small minority are have a computer science or software engineering background. And that's maybe specific to our niche of the open source world, because there's a lot of complex math and statistics, and that's honestly a lot harder to learn than it is to learn how to code.
Got it. So the coding's easy, but learning the complex math or the statistics that you would apply to your code, right? That's the difficult part.
I won't claim coding is easy because you can go as deep as you want, right? But for me, It was like that. I started doing experiments, and it generated two things. It generated a lot of data that I needed to analyze, for which I needed a language like Python and projects like NumPy and SciPy. I also needed to control my experiments, so there were lasers and magnetic fields and mechanical parts and all that good stuff, and that needed to be controlled in a synchronized fashion. So both of the things required learning how to code. So I think working on open source really helped me with that part as well, and that continued when I went to industry. So at some point I had the longest job I had was at ASML, so semiconductor industry. It was a very interesting job. Like you work with 1,000 engineers on one machine. So there was a lot of thinking about APIs and stakeholders, but I was talking to clients or getting new features or things that weren't working well, and you really had to understand a bit of the physics, but then prototype algorithms to improve the machines that we were selling.
Right. That's incredibly interesting, and that makes a lot of sense, right? How you would apply the math and the physics, right, into coding. Now, curious, right? Because sounds like you were solving a lot of your own problems with some of the coding that you were doing with Python and SciPy, right? But you also talked about, actually, before we get there, I'm very curious. You talked about lasers and magnetic fields. Can we go there for a second?
Yeah.
Were these some special projects you were working on? Tell me a little bit about that.
The little esoteric part of physics. This started in the mid-90s, actually. The idea was if you take gases and you cool them down to almost absolute zero, like a microkelvin above zero, right? So basically at that point, the individual atoms are standing still, and you can observe them really well. Right, so you can do like spectroscopy, or when you make them dense and cold enough, you can even get completely new states of matter. So in my PhD, I did statistical physics, basically like make them like a simulator to simulate metals. With a laser, you can make a standing magnetic field, so with interference, right? Like if you throw a rock in the water, you see the ripples, right? You can make those ripples with light, and you basically park atoms in the wells of each. Of those ripples. And that worked as when you then like push them in a certain way, it's like a simulator for how, a solid would behave.
Yeah.
So that was a lot
and so when
of
you're
the
doing
interest.
experiments like that, is the interest more in just being able to determine, hey, how the laser interacts and changes these, or doesn't change the molecules, but like states them or stacks them or groups them, as you just mentioned? Or is the intent like, what's the use case for this? Is it more experimental or use-oriented? Curious.
There was very fundamental physics. Like, you tell a physicist you can make a new state of matter, they get really excited, right? Even if it has zero use. Sure. One of the practical uses at the time was time measurement, because it was the most precise way to measure time. Because an atom is like, it's usually, the standards for time are based on transitions inside atoms, right? Like they...
Sure.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. You don't have to say sure if it doesn't make sense. That's all right.
No. I think that makes sense, right? I mean, everything's made of atoms, so I'd imagine that would echo throughout everything else that exists. Yes. I mean, that's at least the connection that I'm drawing. Let me know if I'm drawing the wrong connection.
So you basically shine some light on an atom, and you try to like excite something, and you measure what comes off in a different direction, right? Okay. Very simplified. If it stands still, you don't get things like the Doppler effect. So you just get a more accurate, like readout, let's say.
Okay.
So that was a practical one. And the more modern ones are things like, quantum computation. Very, very hot right now. We were starting to do that with like, 2, 3, 10 atoms. And that was very researchy. And now they're up to like thousands. Companies like Google and IBM, and as well as large research labs in academia are, have gotten a lot further, and it starts to get into the realm of being practical.
Okay. Very interesting. And I didn't know that I should probably do more research on the quantum computing side of the house, but I didn't realize that has to do with studying the atom, how it interacts, and then that allows you maybe some of the computing power that quantum computers have. Am I connecting the dots correctly? Is a sequence of events kind of work like that?
Yeah, there are different ways of making quantum computers, but I think one of the first and still primary ones is what I described with like lasers and atoms and really cold gases.
Got it. Okay. Seems like a really interesting field to study.
It was fun,
you're in that for a bit, and then you ultimately ended up, I guess, pulling out of the physics world, right? And going all in with I think community-based programming.
At heart, I'm more an engineer than a scientist, I would say. So
okay.
I was never excited by papers. Academia was really driven by papers, but also when we did something new, I was interested in doing it right. So if we got it once, we could do it repeatedly. While if you're a scientist first, you care more about that first time because that's the novel time.
Yeah.
So I was always, even then, working on the lasers, the programming, the data analysis, and make sure that everything was as good as possible. And that's how I started using Python and NumPy and SciPy. And, then at some point there was a quiet weekend, and there was a call for contributions, and I thought I'd try that. And it kind of, changed the rest of my career a little bit over time.
Okay. So your passion is more in making processes repeatable.
Yes.
Is that fair? Fair? Okay. And I could see so I'm starting to connect dots between then your background, right? And you're getting more into the community-based development of programs that are going to be helpful for other developers and figuring out how to make them repeatable. And then I would imagine some of that plays into your current role now as the CEO, right? And you're essentially doing that at scale. Like, what did that transition look like for you, right? Going from maybe doing a lot of the work yourself, right? Mm-hmm. As somebody who is a developer to now you're leading a team of developers and trying to help them have that and share that same vision.
So I have to say, I'm not a CEO all by myself. We have two CEOs at Quansight, and I started Quansight Labs by myself, but I got too busy. Like at some point, I was managing more than 20 people, and it just wasn't sustainable. And then Travis suggested like, well, why don't you just hire someone who reports to you? And I thought about it like, is that really going to work? Why don't I try and find someone at the same level as me? And that's why I found Tanya Allard, my colleague, who's, now we're running the company together, which is great because you can bounce ideas off of each other, but also like it gives both of us time to spend at least 2 days a week, to lead projects, to do some hands-on work, keeps you in touch with, what's actually happening in the company. And it's also a lot of fun to do. I also like learning the new parts of the CEO role. I mean, I already had to manage a budget before, but, I didn't really have to directly work with accounting as much. Yeah, and I was responsible for executing project well and make sure that, money flowed in. But now I'm just more responsible, right? Like responsible for everything. So there's a lot to learn there. Some things are just an extension from what I was already doing. But I like that I want to keep in touch with the applied side of it. I wouldn't want to do the dealing with dollars and paperwork like 5 days a week.
Right. And so this balance, I mean, managing 20 people who are all doing different things, right? Because I imagine all 20 of the folks who are on your team, they're working on different experimental portions of the overall process and vision that Quansight is trying to develop with Quansight Labs. That I imagine that was very, very difficult. I've worked on teams where I was managing 10 individuals who are all doing very distinct things. And it's not like you have a team of project managers who are all managing similar projects. Everybody's going in different directions. And so getting a grasp on that would take all your time. So interesting play almost, for you instead of bringing on almost. Now, what I'm curious about is I think a lot of people in your shoes would have probably hired somebody, maybe hired a couple of managers underneath them. It sounds like, what was your drive to bring in a peer? I mean, obviously you said you could now bounce ideas off of them and you each have your own time to get involved in the projects, but what was the main driver for you to bring in a peer rather than a direct report?
I think I was motivated to find someone like, as capable as possible. In the end, the growth and the scaling is limited by the bandwidth of leadership. Right? So I'm thinking if I hire someone who reports to me, it's like, hey, I have one more person to manage. I don't really want that. That's a less appealing role. So they're not going to be at my level, probably. If they're at my level, they probably shouldn't be reporting to me, right? And I really thought that I would prefer to work with someone else, with someone who's on the similar wavelength and at my level. And it would also be better for the company to have at least one more person at that level. Because at that point, it was just me and Darhas, my colleague, who did the consulting side of things, who were like basically hands-on, like senior technical leaders. Building that group from 2 to 3 would just scale the overall bandwidth of the leadership team.
Absolutely. That makes a lot of sense. And I loved your what you just said about the team's growth is limited by the capacity of the leadership team. And so you were encountering a point where your capacity was probably drying out. As you look forward, Ralf, because now I'm curious, right? Obviously, Quansight has grown quite a bit over the past couple of years. How many years have you been there total?
So almost 7 by this point. Yes.
Okay. A couple of years flies fast. Now it's been 7.
Yeah. There you go. So we're actually grown and then slightly shrunk because like 4 months ago, half our team got acquired. So that cut our size in half.
Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah. So we had the consulting team who did mostly like applied projects. And then we also had consulting on open source projects. Like our biggest consulting project was working on PyTorch, which is the most important library right now for deep learning, AI. That part was going really well. The applied part was like a little bit tougher, but still doing well, like a high quality team. And we had a partner company, Open Teams, which was doing basically all the backend services, right? And doing that for us and for some other companies. And they wanted to pivot and move more into the applied AI space, which was a good pitch. It was actually like their pitch was really good. Investors would look at it and say, "That's a great team. Where's your team?" And they're like, "Oh, we have a team. It's at Quansight." And like, that's not a message that worked really well with investors. So they decided to try and like acquire that half of Quansight, and we could take the Quansight Lab part and make that from basically an unofficial public benefit division of a for-profit company, an LLC, into a formal public benefit corporation.
That makes sense. And so you basically split off at that point. You're still with Quansight, which is focused on the public benefit. Are you all still involved in the other work that is split off and been acquired?
Yes. Yeah. We're still working. We're still having joint projects. We're working closely together. I think I'd imagine that gradually drifts apart over time, as on both sides, people get hired who never, worked with the colleagues that are now in the other company.
Sure.
But it's as Quansight, yeah. So we grew over the 7 years, like gradually. And now we just cut in half, and now, we have to regrow.
Yep. Awesome. That's exciting. So when you look forward to the future, right, your last move for growth, obviously you grew and then split, and now you're going to be growing again. Do you envision a world where you're doing a similar split to what you did the last time that you brought on an additional CEO and running additional segments? Or are you looking, if you look at companies that are 150 employees large, right? They structure things a little bit differently, where maybe the CEO would be doing more of the quote unquote boring, paperwork, right? And visionary in laying out the plan, and you wouldn't be as involved with the projects.
Yes. Although co-CEOs are still fairly rare, but I'm seeing many more of them, maybe also because I have more of an eye for them now. But there's a number of high profile companies that are starting to have them now. So I can see a split again, but it really depends on the situation. Like, one reason might be is that we are a consulting company, and we always said from the beginning that we don't do product. So if we have a great idea, we spin that off as a separate company. The reason really is that if a product goes really well, it needs investment, and then it either grows really fast. At that point, it will subsume everything else, because it's now all of a sudden the one critical thing to, the health and growth of your company. Or it does not do well. At that point, what do you do, right? If you're short of money and, your investors are getting unhappy, then often what I've seen in other companies is that then the people doing open source focused work, which, at best pays for itself. Sometimes it's just a long-term investment that doesn't pay for anything right now, right? It's the easiest thing to cut, right? And then that's what you cut. So either way, success or failure, it would jeopardize why, the work, the community focused work, which is one of the main reasons we started the company.
Right. That completely makes sense. And you want to protect that, because that's your culture, right? And while that culture may spin off new ideas, like you mentioned, new products, maybe you'd have a CEO over top of a product that would run and scale that product very quickly. And probably somebody who has experience doing that would be best suited to help that grow. You still want to protect the community-based work that is at Quansight's core.
Exactly.
Makes sense. All right. So Ralf, something that we talked about, you're a world traveler. And I have a lot of respect for that. And you'd mentioned, right, there's something that I see a lot in the tech industry. Obviously, there's a big push for return to office. And you are in a position where you manage a global team of experts, right? I'm curious, what's your view on return to office and Quansight's future?
Okay, so I'll start with Quansight's and my own perspective. So we're basically drawing a large part of our employees from the open source community. The open source community is inherently global, right? Very well-known projects like that, like the ones we're working on, like in NumPy or SciPy, Scikit-learn or Jupyter, CondaForge. They have on the order of 10, maybe 20 at best, active maintainers, right? So most of them are happy where they are. A few might be looking for a job, right? So that if the right candidate shows up, you want to hire them, you want to be able to offer them a job. So that inherently makes us a global company. Right now we in, I think, 15 or 16 different countries. That hiring was really hard at the start. Before the pandemic, there were just not so many options to employ people. And if you tell someone, it's we'd love to hire you, but you have to start your own, small business and deal with your own, tax returns and so on. That is not a whole lot of fun, right? So it is now much easier to use employers of record and employ people in different countries and offer them benefits and a pension and things like that. So from that perspective, it got better. The pandemic accelerated that process, really.
Okay. Totally makes sense.
And then
because whereas before you'd have everybody on a 1099 contract, right? Or they would be they have to start their own LLC. That's a big undertaking. And You're absolutely right.
It's in 2018 when I started 2019, I wouldn't want to deal with that. Like,
No.
I have a job. Like, I want to do interesting stuff. Like,
Right. I just want to code, right?
Yeah, you
I
can't
wanna...
pay me enough to go to my, local business office and figure out like how to start a company.
Right. And so is that kind of how you're operating now? You'll basically employ people from different countries, but they will be kind of on the team as individual, like independent contractors, but you're able to provide them with the benefits through an employer.
Yeah, it's still a mix due to legacy reasons. People have been here for a while, have everything set up. Like they probably didn't want to change at that point. Right. But yeah, we've always tried, like independent of employment status or country, to offer everybody the same benefits. You have to make sure then that the benefits are generous enough that they apply to the local laws in every country, right? So US, like, PTO, for example, like US isn't mandatory, but in many countries, like there's a minimum of like, 30 days a year. So that means you have to give everybody at least 30 days a year, right? Like otherwise you don't treat them equally. So that makes, we ended up with some culture that's somewhere in the middle between Europe and the US, because that's where, jointly the majority of our team is. PTO, sick leave, that kind of thing, parental leave seems generous with the US, with US glasses on. With European glasses on, probably not so much, but that then has to be compensated by the opposite side. The salaries in the US are a lot higher, right? So it's like we can keep everything like nicely in the middle, and it seems to work for everyone.
Okay. That's cool. I hadn't, the benefits in figuring out what the norms are in different countries and still being competitive, right? To attract that talent that you want on your team.
That was actually really hard to figure out in the beginning, because imagine, you have someone from the Bay Area and someone from like a smaller city in India, right? Like their cost levels are way different, but like, if they do the same job with the same skill level, right? Do you want to pay them exactly the same? Like probably not, because the skill level is very, very, the cost level are very different. But do you want to look just at the local market rate and, give one person 10x more for the same job? No, that's also very unfair, right? So how do you actually treat people fairly and then explain that in a way that everybody's happy with it is not so easy.
I believe it. Do you have a guiding principle that you try to strive towards that, is what you would define as treating everybody fairly?
Yes. So we've actually written up like an internal model that says like, okay, here's the like roughly the formula for how we do that. Like there's some human adjustment that goes into that, but like now, for example, the maximum difference between like the most expensive and the cheapest locations and markets can't be more than a factor of 2 for the same role and seniority. Different companies who published their approach to that, like there's a few companies that like just do completely the same for everyone, and then when they're successful, that means they just end up paying like Bay Area salaries, worldwide, which isn't practical for most companies.
Sure.
And then,
I mean, it's a great deal for somebody in the Philippines or who's living in the US, decides to move to the Philippines, right? And still continues to receive that Bay Area salary.
Exactly. That'd be great, but you can't run the world in that, right? And I've seen people try that. And if they're mostly US based and then they do that, then they figure out that they can't really provide any services anywhere outside of the US because they're just too expensive.
Interesting. That makes a lot of sense, right? If you're trying to not only attract a global market of talent, but then also provide a product that's marketable on a global scale, you're naturally going to have discrepancies in pricing based on country.
Exactly. Yes.
Okay.
So yeah, you have to think about that very well and kind of, depending on your priorities, right? Maybe you want all your customers to be in the US because that's just easier, right?
Yeah.
But your team global. But if you want global customers, then, you can't have the, let's pay everybody like US market rates.
Totally makes sense. And imagine with your company, given that it's community based, right? And everybody that you are, in service of with what you're providing is globally based. You probably want to make sure that it's marketable globally.
Exactly. But there's a much more interesting complication, actually. Like we're working mostly in communities where the majority of contributors are volunteers, right? So now let's say you have a role and there's 4 people on a team that do similar things, and you're gonna have to hire one of them. You can't hire all 4, right?
Right.
Now you have to figure out like who are you going to pay? And what are you going to pay them for? Right? If that person gets to just still do whatever they did before for free, and now one person gets paid, the other three still do it for free, like trying to squeeze out the last hour that they could have spent reading a story to their daughter, or going to a bar or whatever, right? Going to the gym. Right? That's not a fair trade-off. So you actually have to also make sure that the person you pay now has to do more of the, let's say the chores, or, the things that people can't do on the really complicated or boring stuff that takes a long time that the others can't do, right? So that it's also a win for the other three. And that trade-off, and how you pay for that trade-off, because our clients don't want to pay for the really boring stuff. They want to pay for the cool stuff, right? So how do you make a model where I let my client pay for the cool stuff, but we still make enough money that we also do the boring stuff so that the community stays happy?
Got it. And that's that funnel, right? Where you're making the money to keep on pushing the envelope in your labs for the cool stuff, but then funding, right, with some of that money, the folks who are doing the recurring boring stuff, right? Patching it up, making it more consistent, making it scalable.
Exactly. Yeah. And that always has to be a primary concern, because otherwise, if the volunteers run away, it's a loss for everyone.
Is this common? Is it common in your industry, in the tech industry, to have a group of both paid and volunteers working together on the same project?
It is common in open source, and large parts of open source are volunteer driven. And a lot more money has flowed in continuously over the past 20 years. At the start, open source were just a few hobbyists in the corner, right? And right now, the newer projects, there's also a lot of open source projects that were created by corporations, right? And they're very different. But that's a completely different ballgame, right? It's like, if you're a large company, or a Google, or Meta or whatever, right? And you're I have a thing internally and I think this will be helpful for everyone. They usually have a business case to then open source that, right? They want other people to adopt it so that, other people start to build on top of it, and it kind of becomes a win-win for them. But they only keep investing as long as it's a win for them, right? So that exists too. But are part of the open source community, and that's typically things like programming languages, like low-level libraries that everybody needs. For us, it's like the scientific computing tooling, right? So there's a lot of people who come from an academic background. They needed that stuff. They started to contribute, and then it was fun, and then they never left.
Right. You got them hooked. Exactly. And now they're making a living, or in most cases, right? They're making a living doing what it is that they love.
Yeah, I'd say in some cases. Yeah, I'd say it's still a minority. Yeah.
Okay. Interesting, Ralf. That was super interesting to walk through. And I know we had talked about at our last conversation some of the, I guess if you want to call them differing interests that come in when money gets involved. So you were just talking about the example where a large company creates something and then they want to put it open source, and maybe they only keep on pushing it to the benefit of themselves, right? But once it becomes experimental or potentially not beneficial to them, funding might get poured or resources might get pulled. We talked a little bit about VCs, right? And being VC backed, and maybe some of the pros and the cons of that. So is Quansight VC backed?
No, and I don't think we ever will be.
Okay. Tell me a little bit about that.
Okay, so VC investors, they can invest large sums of money if it's something that looks really promising, but they're aiming for very large returns. So typically, the trajectory is you start small, you get X amount of million with the idea that you're going to grow really big and then make them 10x return on investment.
Sure.
And the idea,
which is huge, by the way. 10x is huge.
Yeah, but maybe it's 20x, right? But 90% of the VC-backed companies fail. That game on average, right, for VC funders, if 9 out of 10 fail, but the 10th one makes 20x, right, that doubles their money, right? That's kind of, the ball game they're playing, which is good for them. It might actually be interesting for the people who get hired to work on, some VC-backed thing, because, it goes very fast, right? You're probably going to work on something that is potentially impactful, but there's also a 9 out of 10 chance that your company is going to fail and you have to go look for another job. The kind of people we work with, the talent level is very high. If you lose a job, good chance, you find another one, and it might be even higher paid. The impact is survivable, right? All these people have also they have a lot of education. They usually they'll be all right. But the communities around that are going to suffer more. If you take something that, used to be sustainable and there were a group of volunteers, and now you all of a sudden start trying to like hire everybody who is really good at this stuff, trying to like speed up the development process a lot to grow as fast as possible. And now you're at the end of the runway. All of a sudden you go from like, you take a project, accelerate it a lot. At that point, you probably make it more capable, but also a lot more complex. Right. And at that point, if, the money goes away and all these people that went from working on it part-time to full-time, now go to not working on it at all, your project's going to have a really hard time, right? It might die, it might survive, but it's not going to be in good shape. Right. So we want to avoid that kind of effect.
Got it. And then I imagine individuals who come and work for Quansight, right? That's a benefit that you offer them, right? You're a community base. It's a more long-term driven, more strategic driven. You're going to be working on a project. If that project fails, I imagine there's other projects that can be worked on. And so there's the stability there.
Exactly. So yeah, we don't want community projects to ever fail. That's why, we will never try and hire as many maintainers of one project as we can. Like my ideal is have one or two of every project, right? So they can interact and learn from each other, but there's still a small fraction of the overall team, right? So if something goes wrong, it's not a problem for the community. And then the second half of your question.
No, the second half of my question was just more, if you're working for a VC-backed firm, right? There's probably more ups and downs working for a company like that. It might be short-term driven. Like they're accelerating towards that pass or fail, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Versus in a community-based environment, there's lots of opportunities to continue working on projects, even if maybe one of the micro projects fails.
That's right. Yeah. So for us, like our developers usually work on 2 or 3 different projects at once, right? And it might be a client project and a grant funded project and something we do internally to kind of, we take some of our profits and then try to do something impactful for the community. So that's unfunded, but let's say internally funded, right? So, and the balance of that shifts over time. So if any one, source of funding or project like dries up or fails, it'll shift to other projects. So we can offer like, sustainable careers in open source that, isn't possible if you focus and go full steam on exactly one thing.
Yeah. What I love about that is it's consistent with your community-based design, right? That was your focus from the start. And so not only are you focused on the community at large globally, the users of your products, but you're also focused on the community internally that you're building up with your team.
Exactly. And I think when you hire people and you interview, that's one of the purposes of, I think, especially the hiring manager interview, you have to give them that perspective, right? And you have to be honest about that, because if you're not, they're going to figure it out soon enough after they arrive anyway.
Yeah. So just one more quick question about that, and then we'll move to close because I know we're coming up on the top of the hour. But this has been really fascinating. So you mentioned being transparent at the start. They need to know what they're getting themselves into, right? That's important. But then once they join the firm, right, what keeps those individuals?
I'd say 2 things. One, you have to offer them for a significant part of their time something to work on that is really impactful. Right? That's the best way to keep the best people engaged. And then you have to build a high trust environment. Right? You can't micromanage that type of developer. So my approach to that is like, you tell people you trust them, you then proceed to actually trust them, but you still have to verify that. But that's, you praise in public, you verify in private and give feedback if something goes wrong. The best part is that a lot of the developers I work with, they're much better at a lot of the things than I am. I also find this stuff fun, and I keep hands-on enough that I can at least have interesting conversation with them, tell them things that they learn from, encourage them, and verify, that things are actually going all right.
That's amazing. We're going to chop that one up and put it in a short, Ralf. That was awesome. Just how you create a community of, of high impact individuals, right? And you keep them on the team, right? You show them that you trust them. Obviously trust but verify is there, but when you show them that you trust them, give them the space to be successful, and then keep them engaged by feeding them the projects that are aligned with their interests, right? They're kind of putting that burden on their shoulders and pushing it forward. That's how you keep high impact individuals on your team.
exactly. And that's the hard part. Everybody will, it's very easy to say, hey, I trust you, Greg, right? If then the next day I turn around and gonna, check your every commit, and it's like, well, why do you only have 3 commits and not 5 yesterday, right? Like,
yeah,
it's not going to make for a very good long-term relationship.
All right, Ralf. Question that I ask everybody on the show before we close out here, right? You've had a pretty awesome career, right? Coming in as somebody who was deep into physics, transitioned into the computer science world, did a lot of programming yourself, and now you're the CEO of a pretty successful company. What's that advice that you would give to other developers who eventually want to be where you're at and running a global community-based, right, company like Quansight?
I would say, well, interestingly enough, my very first manager told me, they're going to try and push you into management. Try and stay out as long as possible. Right? Like, I think a lot of the, I never wanted to be a manager. And I tried to listen to him, and I worked for a while. It doesn't work forever, right? At some point, you just naturally gain more responsibility, and you look around and you're like, well, stuff needs doing, and there's no one else, who's going to do it anymore. And then you have to do it. So I would say keep an open mind, and try to learn things look around and, pick up the best like tips, techniques from other people that are community leads, project leads, or, your managers or people higher up and more experienced in the company. But then do things that you're really interested in. And I don't think very many people should want to be a manager. They should want to be a leader in some form. But that will come naturally as long as you keep doing impactful stuff.
Love it. Ralf, this was super fun. I learned a lot. A lot of insights packed in here, just kind of talking through your career and how you're growing Quansight. Super excited for the future and the work that you all continue to develop, right? And the benefits that you're going to give out to the community. So, Ralf, thank you so much for joining the show.
Thanks, Greg. This was a lot of fun.